So let's talk about climate change and the
Let's do it.
narratives right now around climate change. So when I was a kid growing up,
Mhm.
they told us that an ice age was coming, that we were all going to be like living amongst the polar bears.
Right.
And I remember thinking, oh, that sounds miserable. Like, I don't even know if my first thought was, how are we going to survive, if it's freezing? Then my second thought was, would we want to survive if it's freezing? That sounds miserable. I want to live in a tropical place. Um, but now, of course, fast forward a couple of decades, and only a couple of decades fast forward. And then they say, oh, no, it's not the ice age coming, it's global warming coming. But the earth has been around. And then there's this whole narrative of it's going to we're destroying the planet, and which makes zero sense. It seems like the planet's been here for a long time, probably will be here for a long time after us. Um, you've been looking into this, and you go obviously way deep into history when you do your research. So, what are we in right now? Are we warming or are we cooling?
So this is a wild topic, and so a lot of people might not be aware that approximately a year ago, Elon Musk was on the Full Send podcast with the Nelk Boys, and something he said caught my attention. Where they were talking about in the context of human civilizations dying from a catastrophe, and he said that ice ages are, quote, a deep, deep rabbit hole. And then he went on to say it again, a deep rabbit hole. And so this is something that I basically went down that rabbit hole, and I was astonished at what I came across, and lots of data that is not being included into the conversation involving man-made climate change. So to answer your question, when the scientists said decades ago that we were going to freeze, they were actually correct, but they were early. So there's something called, and I could bring up the graphs if people
Yeah.
want to see. So like, I'm not pulling this from Bob's website. This is mainstream science. So it's on the data on the climate data slides. Let's see. It's not showing. You just have to click on it.
Oh, I can't. I think it's gone. Is it this other one?
The climate. Does it say climate
Okay,
data?
this one.
This one. So I'm going to
Okay.
skip forward a few slides. We'll come back to what this gentleman had said. Give me a second. This will all be good stuff to talk about. I had this in a certain order. Okay, so glacials and interglacials. So what people need to understand is that we are in the middle of an ice age right now that started 3 million years ago. I'm quoting Utah Geological Survey. It shows up at the top of Google. It's prestigious. All this
How
stuff
old,
is supported.
how
What's
old
that?
is the Earth to start? Like how how long's the
They
Earth been
say
around?
4.5 billion years. Listen,
Okay.
I'm not some new young Earth creationist guy, but like when they throw these billions and billions of years, I honestly don't necessarily think they could say that with an absolute fact. But I'm not here to deny it. I don't
Hmm.
really old. I'll get on with that. But so
So
okay,
3 million. Okay, so let's say the world is 4 billion years old. So three
mhm,
million years ago, an ice age starts.
correct. And
Okay.
so over the last 11,000 years, we've been in a period of warming. And so this is something that people need to really understand is that there's something called glacials and
Hmm.
interglacials. Glacials are periods of cooling where there's an abundance of growing glaciers throughout the hemisphere. And then during periods of warming, interglacials is that the data shows that over the last 450,000 years, there's been four, arguably five periods of warming, interglacial periods. And and so
Oh.
this is where things get wild. And this is probably a little too small for people to see, but I already know what it says. Is that, like I just said, our interglacial that we're in now, right now, where it's
Hmm.
warm and our glaciers are going away, started 11,000 years ago. But what's interesting is that the periods of warming last several thousand years, whereas the periods of cooling last tens of thousands of years. So
Oh.
historically, 7 to 9 times longer.
Yeah.
Let me just say that again. Glacials last 7 to 9 times longer than interglacials. So, and by the way, the reason why they know this is through ice core data that was taken from Greenland as well as Antarctica. So when Elon Musk was talking about ice ages or a deep, deep rabbit hole, I figured out what he meant is that no matter what we do here on planet Earth, the Earth is going to freeze. So a few
Well, I mean,
decades,
just looking at this, it looks like, so this is 450,000 years worth of data.
yes, and the peaks, the areas that you see where like at the peaks are periods of warming. So
Warming, right?
if you look at the gaps between the peaks, you can see that they're significantly further apart. That the periods of warming are rather brief in comparison. Again,
Sure.
they last several thousand years of warming. and then tens of thousands of years of cooling.
Cooling.
So the
But if you look at the low point of the cooling, it's getting colder and colder each time. I mean, it's
yeah.
the line is going down actually.
Mhm.
Like even right now where we are today, the warming, we're not nearly as warm as it was the last time it warmed yet.
Correct. And so this is what I think. I think that the scientists a few decades ago were correct, but they were wrong by being early, in that they understood the data to show that, oh, okay, Earth is cold more often than it's hot. Let me
Yeah.
also say this. I was on the Joe Rogan podcast approximately a year ago, where I did say my exact words were, I think that the data indicates that the Earth is cold more often than it's hot. And then Media Matters, funded by George Soros, did
Yeah.
a hit piece on me for this, saying that I was contradicting mainstream science. I responded to them with various sources right out of scientific journals, and they didn't include it in their article. And where I was wrong is that I said the data might indicate. No. The data absolutely definitively indicates that the Earth is indeed cold more often than it's hot.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
and
it sounds like every both are right, kind of, right? So
yes, I would agree
there
with
is
that.
an overall cooling effect happening. I mean, just again, looking at this graph, looking at the bottom points, we see that they're getting lower and lower and lower as time has gone on in 450,000 years.
Yes,
But at the same time, we are currently in a trajectory of going up. So we are currently in a warming period,
yes,
but then yeah, it's going to eventually maybe cool and head again towards an ice age. But these things do seem to take thousands of years. I mean, they take
absolutely.
thousands of years, right? So we're not going to be alive to see the cooling part of this.
So here's the thing. So honestly, we don't know that for sure. When it's going to happen, it could happen in our lifetime. It could happen 1,000 years from now, a few hundred years from now, a few
Right.
thousand
Okay.
years from
Right.
now.
Right. We could be at the very peak right now, and
Right.
then suddenly we start cooling.
Exactly. And so
Yeah.
that's one reason why I think that we are on the brink of it. I don't know this. Like, I don't want to be a Mr. Doomsday guy. To anyone listening, I do not know when this is going to happen. And
Yeah.
nobody actually does. What the data shows, though, again, since we're in a period of warming that started 11,000 years ago, and
Hmm.
the fact that these periods of warming last several thousand years, it would indicate that perhaps we're on the tail end of the warming. That how much longer is the warming going to last before it starts cooling? I don't think anyone can say with any bit of absolute certainty. But I will say is that there's other factors that are at play involving the Earth in the cosmos
Hmm.
that play a factor on climate change. So let me just say that these factors that you're looking at here, because people might ask, like, okay, well, what's causing this? And this is where things get wild, is that it involves the Earth's precessional cycle. So let me scroll back a number of slides here. So a lot of people are actually astonished to learn that the Sahara Desert was a lush green tropical paradise up until
Wow.
5,000 years ago. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
See,
I did not know
I'm
that.
happy to hear that, because some people know, but a lot of people, they hear this for the first time, like, oh, I didn't know that.
Well, I will
So,
say, I've always wondered why any civilization ever settled there.
right,
Like, why
yeah,
would you choose that area? But I guess if people were already there because it was a nice area at one point, and then it kind of, then that makes more sense. Otherwise, I don't know why anybody would migrate there.
so listen to this. The Sahara, up until 5,000 years ago, had one of the largest networks of rivers ever known to exist. And it also had the largest freshwater lake ever known to exist on Earth, which was Mega Lake Chad. It's literally like double all the North American Great Lakes combined,
Wow.
of surface area, I should say. And what's interesting is that something happened to create it to change in a flash. And let me just say this, because a lot of the conversation that we're looking at now involving climate change in the context of humans is the rate of change. And
Hmm.
I'm going to argue that it's actually not possible for us to definitively say to what level we are creating the rate of change involving other natural forces. Because here's where things get nuts, is that you'll have different scientific studies that will say that it shifted from green to a desert 5,000 years ago. Some will
Hmm.
say 6,000 years ago. Others will say, like the Smithsonian, 8,000 to 4,500 years ago. Some will say 10,000 years ago. Others will say 11,000 years ago. So here's where I'm going with this, is that if modern scientists today can only ballpark it over a period of 5 to 6,000 years, where some other scientists, let me find, okay, so here's another scientist out of a university that said that it may have been so abrupt that it took only 1 century for the grassy hills and valley lakes to become stark dunes as they are today. So the reason why this is so significant is that And they believe that this involves the Earth's precessional cycle, that the Earth changes on a wobble. It's the reason
Hmm.
why we have a North Star, which is Polaris today. But in the past, it was Vega, and in the future, it will be Vega again. But so it basically means that the portion of the northern hemisphere is going to face away from the sun, and that's related. That's why they say that the Sahara changed. Is that it was once far more green, and then as the tilt slowly happened, it's changed over time. That it created this vast change on Earth. And so here's the point that I want to make: is that if they can't definitively say whether it's over a course of 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1,000 years or 100 years, how can they say with any bit of certainty to what level rate of change is happening today? Because
Right.
they need to be able to articulate that. And when you realize that there's these other cycles happening involving the Earth's tilt, which we know is 23.4 degrees today, well, it used to be 22.1. And then it's going to, and it also was 24.5. We also know, and this is a big factor, is that the eccentricity, let me just scroll over. And if you need me to stop, I mean, if you put me on a soapbox, Kim, I won't stop. But I want people to see this because these are things that
Yeah.
most people have never heard of before, is that there are cycles involving which called Milankovitch cycles, which have 3 variables to them. One is eccentricity, which is involving the Earth's elliptical orbit around the sun. So right
Hmm.
now we're at a near circular orbit, but over periods of time ranging over 100,000 of years, it has a much further orbit away from the sun, but it's constantly changing every single day. Um, Obviously immeasurable by day, but over long periods of time, it does change. But also the Earth's precessional cycle, which I was just discussing in the context of the Green Sahara, changes over a period of 19 to 26,000 years. This one says 24,000 years, but I have other sources that say 26,000 years. But you also have the tilt, which I just described, of changing as well. All 3 of these variables are changing all day, every day, and
Yeah.
they do impact ice ages on Earth. So the reality here is that to what amount is the rate of change being influenced by all these variables, and why am I not hearing about them in the context of climate change? Why am I hearing nothing about interglacials and glacial periods? I mean, why am I hearing nothing about the Green Sahara? Like, these are all significant factors that the human brain can wrap their head around, but I don't hear them whatsoever in the context of modern day climate change. And while I'm at it, if you have a question, let me know. But
Well,
there's
one question is
yes.
that so this was a green Sahara during the time of the Egyptian, but the pyramids. That's what you're saying.
Yes. Yes.
Interesting. So if there was, but okay, it doesn't make sense to me for it to have been a slow change of like, oh, the Earth shifted its axis a bit, and that's what caused it. I mean, it seems like in 5,000 years to go from something that green to something that dry.
Mhm.
Uh, I mean, it seems like it would have been a lot faster, like something like like volcanic activity would have been.
Right.
And that's the thing about the climate change discussion is that a volcano alone, I think, causes more CO2 in the air, right? Is that am I right on that? That's like a bigger cataclysmic event than like anything we could than any farming that we're doing because they're like, "Oh, you're farming and now you're causing Oh, forget about all the private jets, by the way, that fly to Davos. Like, we're not going to be talking about the private jet carbon emission. Instead, you have to stop farming and stop eating food, stop
So
breathing, stop living.
there's a
Um,
notable doctor out of Australia named Dr. Ian Plimmer, who has gone on to provide the data which shows that 97% of all CO2 and greenhouse gases that are created on Earth come naturally, whether it's volcanoes and particularly seafloor vents at the bottom of the ocean, they're constantly
right.
releasing, whereas humans are only producing 3% of the CO2 emissions that are happening today. And what's interesting is that he went on to say that if they can't articulate that other 97% isn't affecting our environment, then it's essentially, in his own words, game over for their narrative. Because it's like,
Right.
sure, we're producing CO2, but I want to remind people that CO2 is plant food. In fact, the periods of, like, say, the time of the dinosaurs, to put this in context, that as of today, we're at approximately 420 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. But in the height of the dinosaurs, it was 6,000 parts per million, which is 1,328% higher. But that was the largest animals and most abundance of vegetation ever known in Earth's history. And the reality is that CO2 is actually plant food. And to put this into perspective,
Mhm.
that modern greenhouses literally pump CO2 into them all day long, and it creates as much as a 30% higher yield. I don't hear this at all in the context of CO2. It's like they making CO2 out to be the devil.
Right.
Um, but just like we saw with COVID and all these experts coming out and shunning other people, whether it's Dr. Robert W. Malone, who had the patents
Right.
on the mRNA technology, whether it's Dr. Peter McCullough, who is the most published doctor in American history, whether it's Nobel Prize laureate Luc Montagnier, the late Montagnier, I never say his name correctly, but he's a Frenchman, who received the Nobel Prize for discovering AIDS, came out to say all these warnings about the narrative. Let's just say
Right.
these people were shunned, censored, and even deplatformed. And so when I see other people like Nobel Prize laureate Dr. John Clauser, who won the Nobel Prize in 2022, and he's since been speaking out as of November of last year, saying that this climate narrative is not factual. He's basically saying that it's a scam to change the global economic situation. So where I'm going with this is that I might not be Mr. Expert, but what I do is my research on what the experts are saying. And when these people are being omitted from the conversation, it makes me have questions.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, that's for sure. Anytime they censor, then it's like, oh, okay, what are you hiding? What is it that we're not supposed to know? Right.
Right.
That's kind of where I go with that right now. Yeah, I don't remember what I was watching, but maybe it was several months ago, and I was watching something about volcanic activity and how that, like we could do all of these various things to try to stop climate change, but one volcano eruption and it's like erased completely.
So
Anything that we try to do.
so that's science, because in approximately 72,000 years ago there was something called the Toba super eruption. And what's interesting about that, so it was like, I don't know if it made Yellowstone pale in comparison, but whatever it was this super volcano. Its eruption was devastating to Earth, and the fossil record shows that the human species may have been reduced to just a few thousand people at that same exact period of time. And a lot of people would say that, well, that's a correlation. It's like that, a super volcano can wipe out Earth, animal species on Earth, including us.
Yeah.
And so I find that interesting as well.
Yeah, well, I keep hearing that if Yellowstone blows, like North America is in big trouble.
Yeah, I'm not. So I don't know what I'm talking about, but I'm not too worried about Yellowstone. For some reason, I'm just not too worried about it.
You think
Maybe
the
I'm just
dinosaurs weren't worried either? You think those ancient Egyptians building those pyramids weren't worried?
they were deniers, so they had what was coming. If they had paid their carbon tax, maybe the effects would have been alleviated. Imagine how
Yeah.
much worse it would have been, Kim, if that the pharaohs didn't collect from the from the from the
Seriously.
proletariat. Um,
Seriously.
you know, if you go ahead. I
No,
don't
you
want
go
to.
ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, you were mentioning, we were talking about the Sahara changing so rapidly, and one of the topics we haven't touched on is involving the Richat structure and this Atlantis theory and how it ties in to the Sahara Desert. If you're able to add these slides that I had
Yeah.
re-added, um, because I have
So is
suggested
it
that what
this one
happened,
here?
yeah.
Okay.
So what I have suggested happened.
So this
Is
is
there a way?
now we're moving on to the lost city of Atlantis. Is that what we're talking about?
Yes, but I should also say that it goes beyond that. In that, hold on, let me just remove this. Let me see if I can make that big. I don't know why it's showing up so small on my screen, but hold on one second here. Why isn't it's not letting me control the
Oh,
actual slides?
I don't know why. I
Let
don't
me
know
see
how.
here. Let me hit stop screen. Let me just re-add it real quick because I think that a
Okay.
lot of people will find it interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, one second. Here we go. This should work this time. All you have to do is re-add me now.
Okay. There we
All
go.
right. So, okay. What people are looking at here is something called the Richat structure, also known as the Eye of Africa or the Eye of the Sahara. Kim, we were talking about this offline, and one thing I wanted to ask you is, when's the first time you'd ever seen or heard of this thing before?
I've never today, right
So
now.
this is one of the most
Wow. What is that?
so this is absolutely wild. It's one of the most bizarre geological features anywhere on Earth. What you're looking at here, let me just pan out for people one more time. This is in
Yeah.
the modern country of Mauritania and the Western Sahara Desert. Um, it is considered to be a volcanic a collapsed volcanic dome, although that's the consensus. It's actually a scientific mystery as it resembles nothing else anywhere on Earth. Um, and what's interesting about this site is that it just so happens to match more than a dozen striking similarities to what Plato had described as the lost ancient capital city of Atlantis. And to anyone that thinks that Atlantis is silly or it's some Disney movie, what's interesting is that the tale actually originates from the Egyptians that claimed that they were descendants, survivors of a civilization that was decimated in a cataclysm, and that they were colonizers who started over new in Egypt. So Atlantis was said to be made up of concentric circles, specifically 3 of water, 2 of land, which would match the Richat structure. It was said to have an opening to the sea at the south. It was said to have mountains to the north. It was said to have an abundance of gold. It was said to be made up of red, black, white color stone, elephants, all these features that match this site as I presented in a number of videos. But to anyone that doesn't care about Atlantis or is rolling their eyes right now, I would say that if there's nothing else to focus on involving this site, is the evidence of catastrophic water flow that bulldozed over the Sahara Desert, so much so that you can see it from space. These are textbook characteristics of fluvial erosion. Let me just scroll past this real quick, because let me just say this site also shows up on an ancient Roman map that describes Atlantiae in the northwest region of the Sahara. So that's just more evidence that I say ties into Atlantis. But those are the red, black, white color stones, the gold. But basically, okay, let me just go back to the beginning and just focus on that one slide so we can just talk about it. But basically, the significance of this is that something happened to the Sahara Desert to cause this mass erosion. So when people ask what could have happened to the Sahara to change it in such a short period of time, this might tie into what people had described in the ancient times of the biblical flood, that maybe it was something related to a pole shift, which isn't something we haven't even dived into yet. But something happened to this region of Africa. And I think that it is quite interesting that most people have never seen or heard of this site before.
But we
What are
don't
your
know
questions?
Yeah, well, I'm just so volcanic activity possibly, or something similar to that. I mean, what do you think?
Okay, so the scientific consensus is that it was a volcanic dome that had collapsed multiple times over hundreds of millions of years. The reason why I don't necessarily, and let me just say, that's just a consensus. Like, you could read articles about this, how it is a mystery. That's just the consensus. They don't know because it doesn't match any other site anywhere else on Earth.
Yeah.
In fact, there are other examples of collapsed volcanic domes, and they don't mirror this as far as its concentric circles. It's something truly bizarre. And so in the context of climate change and catastrophes on Earth, is that this is something that needs to be discussed, is that something terrible happened on planet Earth to create this level of devastation over the Sahara. And the mystery is there. It's like, to answer your question, like we don't know what it is.
Okay.
We think it, and even if it was a volcanic dome, it still doesn't explain the catastrophic fluvial erosion that is obvious from space.
Right.
I mean, you can look,
So
some people say, is this wind? But like, this is not wind
that's
erosion.
kind of what it looks like. Yeah.
Well, if you look at, so I went to, like, if you look up the 10 windiest places on Earth and look at it from satellite imagery, it doesn't match this whatsoever. So, I mean, I could actually show you in my other slides. I don't have them up here, but if you look at textbook fluvial erosion from vast flows of water, that's what this matches.
Wow. Flows of water.
Yeah, it's like basically, I'm trying to say that it appears that a great flood had happened over the Sahara Desert. And if you look at it, if people go to Google Earth and look at this from themselves, you'll see it start over in the middle of North Africa, and it slowly goes down over the western portion.
So you think, and so ocean maybe, because then like thinking what would have killed all the vegetation, right? I mean,
swept it away.
Yeah.
I mean, why this is significant is that the last time the ocean was known to have existed over the Sahara was literally tens of millions of years ago. But like literally 56 to 66 million years ago is the time of what's called the Trans-Saharan Seaway. But what's interesting about this is that knowing that the Sahara was now, green, went back and forth from green and desert just 5,000 years ago, it's like, well, something else had happened. And I think that that's evidence of a cataclysmic event that happened, whether it's the time of Atlantis, because let me also say that there's other evidence that the ocean had bulldozed through here. So there's a scientific study that has a seafloor slide that happened over the west coast of the Sahara Desert, right in front of the Richat structure, that dates back to 11,000 years ago, which is the same period of time of when Atlantis was said to have been destroyed. So let me just say this real quick, because this is significant. Plato had described that Atlantis had been destroyed 9,600 years ago. But that was 2,000 years ago. So it just so happens to match the same period of time of the Younger Dryas climate catastrophe that I mentioned earlier, where there was that 400-foot rise in sea levels. And it just so happens to match this. And now there's a scientific study that shows this ginormous seafloor slide that extends hundreds of miles from north to south and then east to west, right in front of the Richat, which is suggestive evidence that there was a force of water that had pushed everything in the Sahara out into the ocean. And it's literally a mile or over 2 miles of seafloor sediment at the bottom of the ocean there. Something caused that. So that's why I say it's suggestive evidence that there was some sort of force of water that had obliterated the Sahara. And honestly, if you want to know what I really think, I think it ties into a pole shift, which is a whole other animal we probably don't have time to get into today, but there's evidence that the Earth has shifted hundreds of times over millions of years. And the scientists will say that it's not necessarily a flip of the Earth, but that something happens inside the Earth that changes our compasses. It's happening right now. They're updating runway numbers throughout the Earth, around the world, which have to do with the compass. And the Earth's poles are actively shifting as we speak. I mean, this is just, anyone can Google this. This is mainstream science.
Right.
But I think that because what happened on Earth to create that change would have changed flow of weather systems and possibly caused biblical level tsunamis, so to speak. But this is pseudoscience.
And I think that would be like kind of feeding into the biblical stories of the flood, of Noah's flood.
That's what I think. I think that we shouldn't look at the biblical flood as covering all the mountains, including Mount Everest, that maybe it was regional in nature, that there are some areas such as the Sahara, which, like, there's other scientific studies that show that up until 5,000 and 6,000 years ago, that the Sahara was densely populated throughout those rivers and those lakes. And of course, like, if it was green and lush, it was probably the Garden of Eden for all we know, or so to speak. And so something happened to them to turn into a big dust bowl today. So I think that all these things tie in, and that when we look at legends that are passed down by thousands and thousands of years, it came from somewhere, and we shouldn't necessarily believe every single aspect of it. I'm not saying it covered Mount Everest or the Peruvian Andes, so to speak, but that maybe something happened that obliterated a vast civilization a long period of time. That would be my thesis if I had one.
Well, and if you're living in that time period and you don't know how large the world is, and you haven't traveled around, and there's no one who's told you, then you would think that that is everything that there is, that the entire world flooded. I mean, if you could see a flood, I mean, if it took over that entire northern part of the African continent, I mean, that is massive. That would be the whole world flooded to you, if that's all you knew, if that's the area. You know, I mean, that would be. That would maybe explain a lot, right? I mean, then would that explain the loss of the technology?
I think so. And let me also say this: when it comes to technology, things don't last. Like, even stainless steel tooling will eventually rust away as soon as it gets one little chip in it. So, like, anything metallic, everything iron, everything rusts away. Look at the Titanic; it's at the bottom of the ocean. And it's not that it's rusting away; it's being eaten by a unique algae. Or bacteria, I should say, or whatever it is. It's getting eaten away, and it's been over just a little over 100 years, 110 years, and it's more than 60% gone by now.
Right. So just imagine a couple thousand years. I mean, everything gets recycled eventually, right?
Right. The only thing that lasts is stone. So, like, literally any type of metallic tooling that we have is going to go away. I saw some article that said that if humans vanished off the face of the earth today, the only thing that would be surviving would be, after 10,000 years, would be the Hoover Dam. That everything else, like literally skyscrapers, will disintegrate. Like, if you look at World War II vehicles in a junkyard, they're rusted through from one side to the other. The doors are withering away. They're down to just their springs. And within a couple hundred years, it'll be as if it'll just be nothing but dust. Like, it was never there in the first place. Wow. So, like, when we're talking in the context of literally tens of thousands of years, or 11,600 from the alleged time of Atlantis.
Yeah.
People say, well, where's the evidence? Where's the evidence? I'm like, I'm sorry, my friend. The only thing that's left are the pyramids. Like, the pyramids will survive millions of years, but nothing. I mean, because they're so thick. I mean, there's
But
so
they're
many.
stone, right? Yeah,
Right.
interesting.